Hello, I'm Victoria Hills. I'm the Chief Executive of the Royal Town Planning Institute. Thank you very much for joining us to this presidential team special to really start to digest the planning white paper proposals that we're very familiar with now, getting more familiar with, presented in the context of the English planning system. Delighted to be joined by our presidential team here today, who I will introduce. But before I do that, just to really reflect that what we've seen coming out over the last few days is really quite a big change on the face of it for planning in England, and clearly it's going to require some major legislation changes, and at the Institute we very much want to be part of that conversation with government. We'll be organising a number of roundtables across all of our 9 regions to really get to the detail and understand what those proposals really could mean for planning, for planners, for resourcing going forward. And I think many of you hopefully will have seen our headline responses in our press release, which I'm not going to repeat here now. But I will just say that clearly, with so much detail, our position is the jury's out. We want to understand the detail. We want to understand how we can work with government on that. And we genuinely want to be part of that conversation so that we can ensure that the outcomes that come from, I guess, firmed up proposals down the line are the ones that are going to work for communities and are going to work for supporting that green recovery. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce, although she needs no introduction, our President Sue Mann, and start the conversation going. So Sue, from a community engagement perspective, clearly I think the word community was mentioned a lot in the white paper last week. What are your main takeaways, if you like, in 5 minutes? Thank you, Sue, over to you.
Thank you. You're absolutely right. Community was mentioned a lot of times. In fact, it appears 42 times in the white paper, and the word engagement appears 31 times in the white paper. I think just one key thing I want to say at the start is that the white paper clearly recognises the importance of planning, and indeed it uses a phrase which I and my predecessors have often used, which is planning matters. So when reading the white paper, I was struck very much by the similarities between the words used and the words used by Skeffington some 50 years ago with regard to community engagement at the plan making stage. And to quote Skeffington, when advocating the role of communities in plan making, he said, "People should not regard their role as a passive one in which they merely receive proposals and comment on them. They should be ready to give practical assistance in the creation of opportunities to participate, in bringing people's attention to the proposals that will condition a town's future, and in helping others to give expression to their views when policies are being formulated." So what's different 50 years later with this white paper? Well, where we are at the moment, quite sadly, is that the plan making stage of the planning process is where community engagement is currently the weakest. And some research that I did a couple of years ago suggested that for many local plan consultations, response rates were less than 0.01% of the local population. And I think we all agree that's not good enough and it needs to change. So the recognition in the white paper that local plans would benefit from, and I quote from the white paper, a radically and profoundly reinvented engagement with local communities so that more democracy takes place effectively at the plan making stage is very welcome. Likewise, strong community engagement in local design codes is welcome. But if both are to work properly, then responses must reflect the diversity of the communities that we serve, and planners must be provided with the resources to support this. We must, as the white paper says, engage with more than, and again I quote, the willing and able. We need to hear from all sections of the community, and this is where technology will greatly assist. And I agree with the white paper that wordy, complex documents do exclude many from the engagement process. The views of those who are excluded are no less important than those that get involved. Visual documents are, as the white paper says, more accessible documents. They're easier to understand. And I've always been struck by the fact that the majority of those attending a consultation event head firstly for the plan, which is a visual representation of what is being proposed. And the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, which the white paper heavily draws on, had a key recommendation regarding the need to move from what they called an analog approach to engagement to a digital approach. And that really is reflected in the white paper and supported by the aspiration, and again I quote from the white paper, that planners deliver world-class civic engagement. Our experiences of COVID-19 have shown how digital technology can be used effectively to reach out across communities and also to open up the planning system. And digitalisation, where there's a strong emphasis in the white paper on that, offers a real opportunity to make the planning system more accessible, more understandable. And it can be done. A recent digital engagement event in Brisbane, Australia, provided a platform for residents to explore hard choices that needed to be made. What would happen if density was increased or decreased? And the result of that and the way they approached their engagement was a response rate equivalent to 1 in 5 households. But again, back to this needs resources, and it needs a serious change in understanding from communities as to when and why they should get involved in shaping their futures. Where I think we need to think more about community engagement is at the detailed stage, as schemes begin to emerge. So can a design code or a master plan cover everything? How will it fit? How will neighbourhood planning fit? Where engagement rates are traditionally higher in neighbourhood planning, we don't want to put people off. So how will that all come together? What compromises might have to be made? What innovations might emerge at the detailed stage? And how do we test these with communities? And what education and capacity building is required within communities to realise the aspirations of the white paper? Again, it's back to resources. If engagement has been diverse and constructive at the plan making and design code stage, then I don't think we should be afraid of retaining engagement at the detail stage. Indeed, it should actually be much simpler, because by then, if we've got it right, communities will have a better understanding of why things are as they are. They will have greater clarity on what they're being asked and why. So, question out there, do we really need to dispense with it altogether? So community engagement and the way in which infrastructure levy is spent is also a positive move. But again, if the spending is to truly reflect the diverse needs of communities, then it's more important than ever that diverse voices are heard. And I'm unclear, in the absence of the duty to cooperate, how this will work for communities that are close to authority boundaries and rely on the provision of services within a neighbouring authority area, especially if that area secures a lower amount of levy. Certainly something to think about.
Well, Sue, there's so much to think about there, and I'm sorry to cut in because you talk so eloquently and we could keep going all morning and afternoon on that. But I think clearly that point you made on resourcing is something that we'll be taking forward even further in our discussions around the regions and also with government. Now, with so much detail in this document, where to go next? I'm now going to introduce you to Wei Yang, our Vice President, President for 21. And Wei, there's so much in here on design, on beauty. Are there any reflections you'd like to offer initially at this stage, recognising we've got lots of discussion to do? Thank you.
Thanks, Victoria. Hi. About safeguard design and deliver quality, because one of the strong requests in the document is to build beautifully and deliver high quality homes and places. So to assist local planning authorities to produce a design code, the paper mentioned that a new body will be established to support the delivery of design codes in every part of the country. So we all know good quality is not only about visual appearance, but also include many other aspects. Design codes should cover much broader requirements than just the aesthetics and should work in a cross-disciplinary way to safeguard the design and build quality. In the paper, it is proposed that incentives should be given to who want to build beautifully and in high quality. The idea sounds good, but more considerations are needed on how and who to make the judgment. More importantly, the local planning authorities must be empowered to draw a firm bottom line to be able to say no to poor quality development. I think that's very important. I remember Mr. Johnson emphasized many times about trade deal negotiations that you must be able to reserve the right to say no. Otherwise, you would have lost your best interest before you even sit next to the negotiation table. I think that's precisely the same situation. The BBC Living with Beauty report has pointed out that the current 5-year housing land supply appears to be at the expense of everything else, including design quality. So I'm a little bit struggle to see how a threat to punish local planning authorities of not being able to approve within a fixed timetable, and also streamlining the opportunity for consultation at the planning application stage. How will this help local planning authorities to insist a good design quality? It is important to emphasize we are not here to plan housing for the sake of numbers. We are planning communities for the long-term benefits of our future generations. So good design does not necessarily cost more, but bad design certainly will cost more to people's lives and to the environment, which is a price none of us can afford. If I may, I also want to reflect a bit more on the long-term vision and strategic thinking, because there is a deep-rooted inequalities in the country. Long-term thinking and spatial economic plans are needed to tackle them. From what I can see, the planning reform's primary focus is to deliver 1 million homes over this parliament by simplifying the role of local plans. It is proposed that a new nationally determined binding housing requirement that local planning authorities would have to deliver through their local plans. But my questions are how the local communities' midterm and long-term social, economic, and environmental issues and visions will be addressed and considered, and how spatial development strategies will function between the central government and the local governments for elected mayors and combined authorities, because they are crucial in the leveling up agenda. Also, time does not stop at the end of this parliament. A much longer-term timescale is needed to be considered for the decision-making process. As the title of this paper suggested, planning for the future. So I think a 25 years timescale, as well as well-being of future generations X has identified, or 30 years to 2050, or even 50 years to 2070 should be used to plan our future. Do I have 1 more minute to give one final point?
You just have just over a minute, actually. You're doing really well, Wei. So yeah, go for it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I'm conscious of my time. So if I may just cover one final point about how effectively a housing crisis can be resolved. Because there are many deep-rooted reasons for the housing crisis. Some of them are beyond the remit of this planning reform white paper. Based on local government associations data, currently 1 million residential units are being approved but yet to be delivered. Constraints on primary infrastructure such as road, strategic road, railways, sewage treatment works have slowed down the housing delivery. Also, the shortage of construction workers is another key constraint for the housing delivery. They are beyond the control of local planning authorities. The housing crisis in England is an affordability crisis, but the private development-led approach will still deliver many private housing. So in the context of the global pandemic impact and Brexit, has the national housing need assessment been brought up to date? So are we prepared for an aging population? And how will this already approved 1 million residential units fit into the planning reform? If we say add schemes developed under permitted development rights, plus new housing permissions, are we going to face an oversupply issue with wrong type of housing in 10 years' time? So these are some of my questions. Thank you.
Well, Wei, there are lots of really excellent questions there, and I'm sure many of our members and interested parties watching this will be asking the same questions. And you know, it's such a huge topic where to go next. But I'm going to introduce Media's past president Ian Tant. And Ian, as our board of trustees champion for delivering climate action, what are your takeaways in terms of how we're going to get on and deliver these net zero ambitions the government have set?
Well, it's clear in the white paper that there's a an intention to introduce high quality building standards within the construction of new homes and all our buildings. There will need, I think, to be within the development management policies, which we're told will be in the NPPF in future, to provide for the infrastructure to allow for things like electric vehicle charging points and neighbourhood battery storage facilities. But I think one of the key issues it seems to me, is that planning has a major role in helping us move to net zero through the co-location of land uses. It's about how homes, jobs, services are all located in relation to each other, and about how we plan to enable people to travel between them by low energy, low carbon, and indeed active modes of transport. And that, therefore, it seems to me, means that even within the new planning system, where we're trying to speed up the allocation and speed up the release of development, particularly housing, we are going to need at an early stage in the process to start envisaging what the mix of uses will be, essentially what the parameters of development will be within the allocations in local plans. That in itself poses a challenge for local authorities, because they're going to have to be, I think, equipped to be more proactive in setting out the parameters of development rather than leaving these down the line. Personally, I have no difficulty with the idea that once a site is allocated in a local plan, the outline planning permission stage can be removed. But that has implications, and the first implication, it seems to me, is that the environmental impact assessment of development therefore is going to happen at the local plan stage. Again, that means that the allocations are going to have parameters attached to them, so you can actually assess what the environmental impacts will be at a headline level, much in the same way as parameters are used to assess outline schemes at the moment, except that the outline schemes are assessed by the developer, and in future may have to be assessed by the local authority. The third issue that relates to that is the sustainability test, because sustainability, particularly of land use, is not just about the site. Indeed, in growth areas, the sites themselves are rarely inherently sustainable. What makes them sustainable is the facilities, the mix of land uses, the infrastructure provision, and so on that goes on within those allocations. So again, it seems to me, in order for the sustainability test to work, we are talking about local authorities having to take a much more active role at a very early stage in the local plan process in identifying what the mix of uses, what the range of parameters will be for development, in carrying out the environmental impact assessment of that development, and in demonstrating how it passes the sustainability test. We've for some years used the phrase front loading for planning. I think this even more emphasises the importance of front loading in making allocation and bringing sites forward.
Yes, I mean, really excellent points there. Front loading, upstreaming, call it what you want. It's clear that there is a lot of bits of the jigsaw puzzle that have got to be nailed down very early on, and that will require, you know, some serious heavy lifting and resourcing to do it. Now, I'm feeling very generous. I'm going to each give you another couple of minutes to reflect on, you know, some other takeaways from the white paper. There's an awful lot in there, and I'm afraid we're not going to get to all of it today. But just reflecting, Sue, if I may, on this, the role of the planner, if you like. Did you have any takeaways? I know you talked about resourcing, but about the role of the planner in all of this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Victoria. I think the one thing that I was anticipating based on all of the press articles was something that was planner bashing, but actually the rhetoric is not that. It's actually one that recognises the skills of planners and the importance of good planning, and as I've already mentioned, the importance of resourcing. The need for effective leadership is also recognised in the white paper, and very, very welcome. And I was particularly pleased to see the reference to the need for each local planning authority to appoint a chief officer for design and placemaking, something that the RTPI has been calling for some time. And I really hope that will be enshrined in legislation. The white paper also recognises that local planning departments are under great pressure with spending, and I quote, on planning and development down 60% and shortages of specialist skills such as design and ecology. So that recognition of where we are at the moment, I think, is really important. And then the vision that's in the white paper of a system where planners are freed up to be more outward looking and proactively engaging with communities and developers, businesses, absolutely what we want, but it requires investment. And as the RTPI set out in Plan the World We Need report, which is referenced in the white paper, we need a well-resourced planning system. And in having that, we can then play a significant post-COVID role in reviving the economy and seizing that opportunity to tackle inequality and meet the net zero targets that both Wei and Ian have talked about. So I think the planning white paper recognises it's not going to happen overnight. There's an awful lot of resources that need to go in. But just one final point on that, if I may, and it's something that it really struck me. The very first question in the white paper asks people to write down what 3 words are those that they would associate with planning. And I'd be really interested to see what comes out in terms of the current planning system, which is what the question's focused on. But I think we're missing a trick here. I think there should be a second question after that and says, what 3 words would you use to describe the planning system as set out in the white paper? And it's only when we get to comparing those that we start to get a real feel for the value of the changes and the issues that are raised.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's excellent, Sue, and it's good to hear a positive take on that, because for what it's worth, I also read there are some positive words here talking up the role of the profession, and we need to engage on those aspects to think about the points that you set out very clearly there. Now moving on to Wei. Wei, I know that you're a huge fan of the natural environment. I love seeing all your photos up on various social media channels of the natural environment. Are there any sort of takeaways in 2 minutes that you would like to add to what you've already said?
Thanks, Victoria. Yes, I believe the fundamental objective of the planning profession is to create a balanced system for people, nature, and society to coexist in harmony. The white paper proposes that all the land would be put into one of the 3 categories: growth areas, renewal areas, and protected areas. More consideration is needed to test how this will work with our international commitment, such as the UN Sustainable Development Goals and other government commitment and legislation, for example, the upcoming National Infrastructure Strategy and the Environmental Bill. So if I may focus on the environmental aspect, recently I read a report by Food, Farming and the Countryside Commission. A demand-supply analysis conducted by Cambridge University found out that to meet a growing UK population's food, space and energy need, while also increasing the area needed to protect and enhance the nation's natural capital, the UK would need to free up another additional 7 million hectares of land. However, the land for this is simply not there, because the UK as a whole is only slightly more than 24 million hectares. So land and soil are extremely valuable natural assets for the country. Therefore, we need to take a much more integrated approach to utilize the land and to deliver multiple benefits. Public and private open spaces in developable categories should also consider multifunctionality, such as food production, biodiversity, and of course, amenity functions. Effective mechanism is needed to protect natural environment and open spaces in those developable categories to ensure a true sustainable future for all of us. So that's my additional take. Thank you.
No, that's great, and I love that the idea of using the land, the precious resource we have, in different ways, using it better. So thank you so much for that. And Ian, moving on to you for your 2 minutes. As I said, there's a lot of detail in there, a lot of changes, but I think perhaps infrastructure and the changes to how infrastructure is paid for, perhaps it's quite a big change. Do you have any initial reflections on that?
Yes, and it's the idea of an infrastructure levy, which is set either at the national level or at the local level, but replacing Section 106 agreements and replacing the current community infrastructure levy. in principle, I think it's a really good idea. It's a really intriguing idea, which is recognising essentially that such levies are a tax on development. And there is I think, a very credible idea here in raising the tax, the money being paid at the point where development is completed, where properties are sold, where buildings are let, so that it's the point where income arises, the tax is then levied. And that is a really, certainly intriguing, great idea. The concerns, I think, that go alongside that are really twofold. One, for those areas which are low value areas and for which there may actually be no or very little infrastructure levy collected. How is infrastructure going to be afforded and paid for in those areas? Because there will still be development, there will still be infrastructure required to support development. And conversely, for those areas which are raising significant amounts of infrastructure levy, there will still be a concern that they're doing so because there's major development, there is significant infrastructure required. And there's no certainty, as I read it at the moment, that the amount of money raised will have any relationship to the infrastructure and the investments required. And the simple concern here is that, if you haven't got the funding for the infrastructure, that in itself could be a brake on the development delivery rates. And if you want an example of that, just think about school places. For a private housing developer creating a major development, relying on the local authorities to deliver the new schools and the new school places, if they are not arising at the same time you're selling the houses, it's going to be a brake on the housing sales. It's going to reduce the rate of delivery. So there's an intriguing idea there with the infrastructure levy. It needs a lot more further thought. And I certainly would like to see the RTPI continuing its role in helping to develop those ideas and take them forward.
Well, that segues in, thank you, Ian, to my final point before I hand over to President Zoomans to close the discussion today. But, being part of that conversation and actually having a positive influence as the proposals get refined is absolutely the ambition of the RTPI at this moment in time. We are convening 9 roundtables across our 9 regions. If you want to get involved, contact your local region to do so. And lots of questions in this document. That says to us that the government is in listening mode. So let's be part of that conversation. Let's take the positives that we found and let's push on those difficult sort of areas where there are some answers required. But let's very, very much be part of that conversation. So thank you for joining us. I'm now going to hand over to President Zoomans to bring this to a close.
Thank you very much, Victoria, and thank you very much to Ian and Wei as well for sharing initial reactions, and they are only initial reactions. I think there are a lot of conversations going to be going on across the profession, across communities, across the development industry as a whole, and it's really how we think constructively about what we've got going forward. None of us can say the system is perfect, but we want to try and make it an awful lot better and an awful lot something that works for everybody. So I can really thank everyone and thank Victoria, and please encourage everyone to get involved in those regional workshops, because it is about listening from all the different perspectives so we can assemble a really meaningful and weighty and informed response. So thank you to everyone.
Thank you.